Probably one of the most important questions you'll ever be asked. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? You know, that is an eternal question that we all need to ask. What a beautiful reminder. This morning I want to continue on this series, Truth on Trial. And this morning I've entitled the message, The Spiritual War on Gender. Based on this passage in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, which says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." This is I believe, one of the most foundational passages in the Word of God that describes God's purpose and plan for our species, for humans. God gave us, first of all, He gave us this dominion mandate to have control and authority over all of creation. And then it says here very clearly that God created man in His image. You know, that's a beautiful thought in its own. And if you ever have a discouraging day, just stop and look back and realize that you resemble God. God made you to look like Him. That's an amazing thought in and of itself, isn't it? But what I find is incredible here too is that sometimes I think we have this male idea, male version of God, and we forget that in this passage, God says that male and female were made in His image. Both men and women were made in His image. And, you know, every time I look at this passage, I marvel because God knew exactly what He was doing. So when He creates male, when He creates female, He creates both of them to look like Him, but to represent different characteristics that God has. You know, throughout Scripture, we see His masculine characteristics. We see God being a God who's authoritative, who's a God of justice, a God of strength, a God of courage, a God of authority and superiority. He's a sovereign God. And yet, we also see a God who says, I've inscribed you in the palms of my hands. A God who says, though a nursing mother may forget her child, I will not forget you. You know, there's a tenderness and there's a mercy side of God that we would describe as feminine in many ways. And so we see this presentation of God, and so He puts male and female on the earth, and He says, this is good. This is exactly the way I designed it, which is why, as Christian people, we can never veer off from those things. You know, there's denominations, there's people who call themselves by the name Christian today, who have totally veered off and have accepted cultural norms when it comes to this passage here. But the Christian ought to look at this passage and ought to realize that when God made male and female, He put them on the face of the earth, told them to have dominion, to procreate, to bring about life, to be fruitful and multiply. When God put these two people on the earth, He looked at that and said, this is good. This is the way God designed it to be, and we ought never to entertain a direction that moves in any other way. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11, I want us to look at this as a bit of a reminder. We're not going to cover the whole armor of God today. That's for another day. But Ephesians 6:11 says this, put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil, knowing that we have an enemy that is scheming against God's goodness, God's purpose, and God's plan. And we know that from the beginning of time on, from the Garden of Eden, this serpent comes into the garden and says, has God said? All the time challenging the authority of God, trying to replace God's position with Himself. You know, and even in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah describes this devil, this serpent, this Lucifer, as one who wanted to be like the Most High God. And so he's always schemed against the people of God. That's why we go to verse 12 and we can see, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. Our battle essentially is not against government, politicians, against our culture really, media and so forth. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. You know, I want to share a sermon today that I hope all of you will be able to see that this is not a battle that we are facing against flesh and blood, against humanity, or against ideology or people's opinions. This is very, very much a battle that we are facing as Christians today against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And this is what's happening. We see this all over. And then verse 13 says, because of that, because of this truth, therefore, because we know that we're facing a spiritual battle in our world today. This is not a flesh and blood. We can't win this by taking up arms. We can win this by going to our knees in prayer. This is how we win this battle. This is, by exemplifying in following God's order for humanity. So he says, therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand firm. This is where we find ourselves at today in 2026. This calling in the evil day to stand firm. And then notice he lists a bunch of different parts of the armor that he's given us. But the first one that he mentions is this one. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth. And this is why I've been so stuck on this series, Truth on Trial, because everything that we're talking about, everything we're dealing with is an attack on truth. Did God say these things? Did God actually design male and female to represent him and declare it to be good and right? And was this God's purpose? Because we have an enemy that is trying to attack the very foundations on a continual basis. And so the thought here, as we read this passage, is when you're faced in the evil day, you may see denominations around you crumble. You may see churches around you crumble. You may see brothers and sisters around you falling away from the faith. You may see aunts and uncles. You might see moms and dads or whatever. You might see people that you love dearly cratering and giving in to these schemes of the devil. But that is not our calling as brothers and sisters. That is not yours and my calling. Our calling is to, when we see the evil day, to stand firm and fasten on the belt of truth. There has to be a thought where we as brothers and sisters say, no, I will die on this hill. I cannot compromise. I cannot walk away. A few Sundays ago, I was sharing on this goddess of sexuality that was very prevalent in the ancient days. And I just want to go a little bit back to that, because what we're seeing today is almost an exact representation of what happened even thousands of years before Christ entered the world. You're thinking back to the days of Abraham, and even prior to that. There's some interesting things that were said about this goddess that I think when we look at our world today, when we're not under this, we're realizing we're not fighting flesh and blood, but we're fighting against spiritual powers of darkness. We're seeing this realm of demonic influence affecting our world. I want to just share with you a little bit of what history has written about her. I found some of this in the book by Jonathan Cahn. He mentions this about her nature. He says it was not her nature to accept reality as it was, or truth. It was her nature to bend it, transform it, conform it to her will and desire. If her will was to be a woman, she would be a woman. But if it was to be a man, she would become a man. And if you study some of the ancient texts, you'll see that she was the goddess of transmutation and metamorphosis. Her nature was to alter nature, and most specifically the nature of male and female, man and woman. And if you look at some ancient writings, there's an old Sumerian hymn that describes this goddess, and it says, in the hymn it says, her power was to turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man, to change one into the other. Interesting that these are things that our world dealt with thousands of years ago. This idea to blend and blur and mend and merge and invert these two. So maybe you're asking, well, what does that have to do with today, where we find ourselves at today? And I think it's important for us to realize that things like homosexuality and transgenderism are not new to this world. These were things that were practiced by many pagan civilizations years ago. When you read things, for example, in Genesis chapter 6, just prior to God sending the flood upon the earth, in Genesis chapter 6, we're told that the thoughts in the hearts of mankind was only evil continually. And we see that a few chapters later, in Genesis 19, we see God coming to Abraham and saying, you know what, I'm about to rain fire down on Sodom and Gomorrah. And one of the things we notice very clearly about Sodom and Gomorrah was this attitude that we see in our day today, this idea where sexuality became something to be worshipped, that became the lifestyle, and it became a very perverted lifestyle. But these things throughout history have, even during Jesus' day, in the Roman era, you see a very sexualized culture. And so from time to time, we've been seeing this influence throughout history. But what is really interesting that is when Christianity came into the world, when Christ came in, and through his 12 apostles, the church grew. We read in Acts 2 and Acts 4 that the church just exploded. And it started to impact the entire region. And by 300 years after Christ, there was a Roman governor by the name of Constantine who actually declared Christianity to be the state religion. It had so influenced, so impacted the then known world that Christianity was everywhere. And for about 2,000 years, Christianity has impacted our world in amazing ways, has changed things, has often eradicated this way of thinking where there was no inclination to go down these roads. I'm sure there were civilizations and people groups that still did, but for a large part, our world had put that behind them. But as I've been sharing here, when a people group says, you know what, Christianity is not something that's going to define us. It's not something that we want to be associated with. It seems narrow-minded and it seems cruel and unloving. It's not accepting. It's not affirming. When a nation turns itself on those things, and a people group turns themselves on those things, in a sense, according to Matthew 12, they're emptying themselves of the Spirit of God and then giving room for this demonic realm to make its way back like it did thousands of years ago. And that's something that I think we need to consider. And that's why I feel like it's so important for us to realize the battle that we are facing today in our culture is not a flesh and blood battle, but it's from the pit of hell. And there's spiritual forces in dark places that are seeking to exert their demonic authority over our people. But we have a way out. I want us to spend a little bit of time looking at how we are seeing this lie affecting our culture today, because not only do we see the utter perversion like we've seen in the last month in June through all the pride parades and things like that, that we've been seeing here, even in our nation. But sometimes a lot of these things come in really subtly. Sometimes they come in ways where we may not even really realize the effect of this demonic realm that wants to make women to be like a man and man like a woman. And I think we need to consider sometimes how those things get communicated, how those things are portrayed in our society, because sometimes we fall in line with these things and we don't really realize the danger of these things till all of a sudden you end up having a son or a daughter or a loved one start to think and believe these lies, and before you know it, you're dealing with a very chaotic situation in your family. I was reading this quote by Evangeline Lilly. Some of you might know her as a Canadian actress. I don't know how many of you knew that she, I think some of you guys might know her, but yeah, so she comes from the Alberta area, born there, raised with Christian Mennonite values, which I thought was quite interesting. This is a quote that she made, and I think this is really interesting. And I think this is a talk we need to have when we realize that there's a demonic pressure on women today to become masculinized. I think it's an important consideration. But this is what she says. She says, and I like what she says, and I think there's something beautiful in this. She says, I'm very proud of being a woman. And as a woman, I don't even like the word feminism, because when I hear that word, I associate it with women trying to pretend to be men. And I'm not interested in trying to pretend to be a man. I don't want to embrace manhood. I want to embrace my womanhood. You know, I look at that and I think, well, that's beautiful. And I think as we think a little bit about femininity and what it means, I did something this week. I just Googled traditional femininity. And this is kind of an interesting perspective. I want to just share what the internet tells us that traditional femininity is. Women who care about aesthetics and self-care is the first one that pops up. Women who care about the outside package. So they care about things like dresses and skirts and ruffles and materials like lace or silk. The color pink is also strongly linked to femininity in Western cultures. All you guys wearing pink shirts, I'm not sure about that. Beauty practices, wearing makeup, manicures, pedicures, skincare routines, styling long hair. Feminine women are known for the use of perfumes and scented lotions. Their behavioral traits are known to characterize things like empathy, kindness, gentleness, compassion, nurturing, caregiving, raising children, maintaining the household. In communication, femininity is considered to be soft-spoken, emotionally expressive, and prioritizing active listening. Hobbies in homemaking, cooking, baking, canning, preserving food, crafts like knitting, crocheting, sewing, and cross-stitching, home decorating, hosting, party planning. List goes on and on. I just thought it was interesting. Traditional femininity, according to the internet, looks like that. In our world today, you and I both know that if we realize the battle that we're dealing with today is not a flesh and blood battle, you might start to notice some other things that are counter to a traditional feminine lifestyle. If you look a little bit at history, you'll see that after the Industrial Revolution, where the machine replaced physical labor to a great extent, it ushered in factories in much of our modern day workforce, and as a result, women were encouraged to come into the workforce. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, almost the entire people group of women did not get involved in the workforce, at least to that extent. But as a result, as we look at some of these things over the years, women have been encouraged to be financially independent, which is an interesting thought. Women have been told that they can find greater fulfillment in careers rather than motherhood. And as a result, today, what we're seeing is an explosion in things like divorce and adultery. One of the other things that we have been seeing more and more increasingly is that girls are encouraged to reject any feminist ideas. And so, if you've noticed, even in media and books, our culture encourages this anger, aggressive type of spirit towards men. And they'll have things labeled such as girl power. This is a relatively new phenomenon. Now you'll see people saying, defy the patriarchy, right? I mean, in reality, the patriarchy really just comes from the Latin word pater, which means father. So throw off, this restraint from the fathers, right? But what is interesting here, if you go back to Sumerian culture, so during Abraham's time, during this history, you'll see that some of the ancient writings written about this goddess actually expressed these very things that we're seeing today. And this is what was described about her. She was the goddess of fearsome divine powers, clad in terror, riding on the great divine powers, drenched in blood, rushing around in great battles, destroying mighty lands with arrow and strength, etc. Spoken of this female entity, this desire for girl power and this warrior spirit. Today we are seeing this kind of spirit all over our entertainment. And I mention these things because this isn't accidental. Gone is the male hero in our entertainment today, and replaced with a female who is now the defender and protector. You're seeing this in TV show after TV show, movie after movie. This heroine comes in and saves the day. It's subtle, and a lot of people are captured by these things because it's combined with beauty. And so in lust and everything comes in together, and so people worship at this altar. Today, as we look at what modern day femininity has done to men, it has relegated them often to the far corners. In an article that's called Tomorrow's World, someone has written this, I thought was really good. It says, what are the fruits of 40 years of feminist activity? What does their utopian world actually look like? On the positive side, women have better wages, more freedom, more opportunities, and fewer barriers in nearly every aspect of life. However, these new freedoms have spawned a host of problems. As women left home for the workplace, the quality of family life deteriorated. You don't have to look too far to see that. And it says, and latchkey children appeared. I don't know if you know what latchkey children are, but latchkey children are largely considered to be children who are in school all day and then come home to an empty home. There's no mom there. Mom's at her job. Dad's at his job. And so these children come home to an empty house. One of the other things this article reveals to us is that trashing traditional moral values and the lack of parental supervision in the home has led to increased sexual activity among teens, soaring rates of sexually transmitted diseases, a 400% rise in births to unwed mothers, increasing numbers of children living in single-parent homes, and the feminization of poverty. Legalizing abortion to facilitate sexual freedom has killed millions of babies and scarred millions of women. Daycare, the option for many working mothers, appears to foster aggressive and defiant behavior. Journalist Dale O'Leary noted that educating young people to believe that men and women are the same, or that motherhood is the same as fatherhood, is lying to children. Pasno saw that feminists and their cohorts in psychology and education brainwashed an entire generation into thinking that the sexes were no different. Is it any wonder that this type of nonsense has resulted in male-female gender confusion with tragic results? Canadian journalist Danielle Crittenden has said this: feminism has failed women. The belief that women should bear no consequences for their decisions, that we can live independently of men and children, that we should live independently of them, is among the great foolish and destructive beliefs of our age. And as a result, if you look at some of these things, you look at our trends today, you look at the pressure upon women today, there's article after article that shows you that women that have embraced modern feminism are miserable and are living miserable lives. That has not enhanced their degree of happiness. And this is what I mean, that this is not a flesh and blood battle. This is a battle, and it's kind of subtle, but it's a battle that under the guise of freedom and liberty and women's rights has actually enslaved women all across our nation and has led to horrible, horrible events when it comes to families. Let's look a little bit at the feminization of men. Because when we're looking at what has happened in our nation, we see this being just as real as the masculinization of women. There's an old Hittite hymn. You remember the Hittites in the Old Testament? Well, there's a hymn where they describe this goddess Ishtar. And this is what they said about her: she will grind away from men manliness. Grind away from men manliness. And I keep bringing this up because as a nation, if we abandon Christianity, we open ourselves up to this kind of influence. And you and I are seeing this kind of influence in our world today, where the manliness of men has been grinded away. According to Google, you look at the internet, what is traditional masculinity? One of the characteristics of traditional masculinity is stoicism, which means emotional control and the suppression of vulnerability. Men throughout the ages, masculine men, have been known to control their emotions. Stoic men are not led by their emotions. Is it any wonder why Paul, writing the New Testament, said that I don't want women to speak in church? It wasn't that he was sexist. He was considering some of these things, this stoic nature that God had built into masculinity that doesn't make decisions based on emotions, that rather makes decisions on the facts. These are good things. These are things that can bless humanity. But in many ways, these things have been discouraged in men. Stoicism. Independence is another one that is associated with traditional masculinity. Independence, self-reliance. This is why you ladies get frustrated sometimes when you're driving somewhere and you're lost and your husband refuses to ask for directions. Every one of you has dealt with that. And part of you gets frustrated at those things, but masculine men have a sense of independence. They don't want to be in vulnerability asking someone else for help because they believe they can do it. That's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But we live in a world where this independent attitude now is considered to be toxic and discouraged among men. I'm not saying that men should never ask for directions or that kind of thing, or that they should only rely on self. But our nation, our history has been better when there's been confident men, masculine men, who have been confident in their leadership, in the ability to get things done. Another masculine characteristic is competitiveness. Throughout the ages, men have been very competitive. And it has driven them to achieve great successes. Whether it's in sports, that's why a lot of guys tune into sports. They love seeing two soccer teams at it. I'm thinking of the World Cup here. They love seeing baseball teams, and they love seeing people give their 100%. They love seeing a pitcher or a hockey player or somebody just giving it all. And that's why we get involved, because we want to be the best at things. There's this competitive spirit in us, and that has caused our nation, it has caused history to achieve great things. It's this competitiveness that drives us to a state of protecting, which leads us to this last characteristic that I just wanted to think about when we think of masculinity, the spirit of protectiveness. This has largely been discouraged in the boys of our age today. They're discouraged in this area. They're encouraged not to be protective, to allow the warrior mom to take over these things. And yet, throughout history, it's the men who've gone to war. It's the men who've sacrificed their lives for the sake of women and the safety and protection of their families. It's men who run into a house on fire and try to save their family. It's men that jump into a lake to try to save someone who's drowning. I'm not saying women don't do those things either. But in large part, men have, at the risk of their lives, because of the spirit, this masculine spirit of protectiveness, have done and achieved great results. One of the things I want you guys to think a little bit about, there's a report that just came out in the UK, United Kingdom, who has been under the attack of this demonic realm for a longer time than we have been. And there's a report that just came out that said in the last little while, 250,000 young women have been raped in Europe. It's an incredible amount. It's absolutely astounding when you look at something like that. How can something like this happen? And my thought is that, my question is, where are the men? Where are the men protecting these women? And when masculinity is destroyed and men are relegated to the far corners of the earth and in the schooling system in our universities, that masculinity is discouraged. What is going to happen? We're going to see a nation of feminized men who no longer see it as their call and duty to protect the vulnerable. And to me, that's ugly and it's destructive. So often now, these things are referred to as toxic. There's an ancient prayer that speaks of power to emasculate men, again associated with this ancient goddess. And it says her mission was to take away their swords, their bows, their arrows, and daggers, and put in their hand the distaff and the mirror. Her mission was to take away the weaponry of men and give them a mirror instead. That's always been associated with femininity. If you look at our culture today, do you not see that? The discouragement of masculinity, it's all over the place. If men are increasingly portrayed as being unable or unfit to lead, that they're told that they're toxic oppressors. You watch any kids' cartoon, men are made into a mockery and a joke as simpletons. And this has led to horrible results. I'm going to share this in a little bit with you here. In our schooling systems today, girls are told to be strong. Boys are not. When a boy displays very obvious male characteristics, in many of our school systems across the Western world, they're very much discouraged and often reproved. Do you know what this has done to young men? You see it across the Western world today. Young boys and men are falling further behind in education. This is a very, very troubling stat to see that young boys are not reading well. Young boys aren't doing math well. When it comes to literature, comprehension. Some of you guys in this room might say, yeah, I don't do any of those things. I leave that up to my wife. In many ways, men have forgotten that education can seek to be a blessing to them. And this is as a result of some of these things, some of these discouragements that we're seeing. You might think that doesn't affect you. But when you watch show after show and movie after movie that describes male characteristics as as some guy that just drinks beer and watches movies all day, watches TV all day, and is no good for nothing, does nothing in the house. If that starts to permeate and become a part of your mindset, it's going to affect your fatherhood. It's going to affect your life as a husband, and it will rob you of what God has created you to be. Today, instead of seeing men in this competitive spirit, a lot of young men are now turning towards video games. They're watching video games, and guess what? Some of the top video games are that young boys and young men, even older men, are playing. They're playing war games. They're playing war games because that masculine spirit has resorted itself to a screen. They're not portraying these masculine characteristics in life, and so they're living in a virtual world, trying to emulate this inner urge for masculinity. So they're going to screens. In sexuality, instead of the young man finding the beautiful maiden and exploring the beautiful gift of love and marriage and sexuality, largely men have replaced these things with virtual reality, with the screen. That's why the hundreds of millions of men are falling prey to things like pornography. They've traded in the reality for virtual reality. And all these things are seeking to destroy civilization. But I think a lot of this is because men and fathers have been told that they're disposable, and they're not disposable. This masculine idea of a man pursuing the heart of a woman and doing everything for her, that's largely forgotten in our day. And I think that's something that needs to change. I just recently read an article in USA Today. In fact, it was written on June 7th, just last month. And in the article, this is what it says. It says men are struggling. Whatever its origins, that men are struggling is not in dispute. A culture that repeatedly devalues men should not be surprised when so many struggle to find purpose, confidence, and direction. Men are now much less likely than women to earn a college degree. Their suicide rate is 4 times higher than women. This is tragic. They struggle more with drugs, gambling, and pornography, alcohol addictions. For years, our culture treated masculinity as something to apologize for rather than cultivate. If Paglia was right that men help build civilization, we shouldn't be surprised that a society that devalues men struggles to produce the very qualities that keep civilization standing. C.S. Lewis saw this trap clearly and said, "We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst." Much of the crime being committed by so-called toxic masculinity is a reaping of what has been sown through the feminization of men. The answer is not demasculinization, but rather reinforcing godly chivalry and biblical traditional values. Article from USA Today. When this demonic influence impacts men today, it does exactly what the ancient goddess attempted to do, to take away the bows and the swords and replace them with the mirror. And you're seeing men today, you see a lipstick and eyeliner male generation. Cross-dressers, transvestites, drag queens. Precisely what this goddess had predicted she would do to men and women. I think this is something we have to consider today. For centuries, thousands of years, the concept that we are dealing with today never existed in our world. But now we're dealing with this new phenomenon called gender identity. By this, it is now possible, according to the teachers of our day, that you can divorce yourself of your biological being. And we're now told in classrooms all over the place, in media, that you can now possess a gender or sexual identity that might be the opposite of what you're born with, your biological gender. Today, you can turn on the news. You can watch our politicians, guys like Mark Carney, guys like Trudeau, using ridiculous labeling of traditional male-female terms and calling them things like people kind and birthing person's day instead of Mother's Day, people with uteruses, bleeders, seed givers. This is disgusting. At the heart of this is an attack on the male-female creation that God talked about in Genesis chapter 1. And we need to see how subtly the enemy has attempted to masculinize the woman and feminize the man. And a lot of this has led towards so much of this transgender culture that we're facing today. People don't understand their own identity. People don't feel comfortable in their bodies anymore as a result of the things that they're constantly hearing. One of the greatest travesties that I think we need to be careful with is this evil entity is pursuing our children. They're after our kids. And we need to be really careful with that. In classrooms all across our land, teachers are telling these young people and planting seeds in the hearts of these young people. All kinds of lies and deceit. Dresses are no longer just for girls, but now for boys as well. Girls can be princes. Boys can be princesses. Jonathan Cahn says this: no generation has been so subjected to a barrage of gender blurring and confusion as that which came of age in the early part of the 21st century. And it was then that a massive change took place. The number of young people and children in America and the West identifying as transgender in America exploded from 2009 to 2018. The number of girls seeking gender transition treatments in the United Kingdom alone skyrocketed by 4,515%. Never before had anything like this ever happened in human history. And our institutions today are training young people to think rather than, or we need to train young people how to think rather than what to feel. They're teaching them largely what to feel. One of the most disturbing things when I think about how our world is after our children is just how in public school systems today, children are being encouraged to really question their biological gender, whether that's really who they are. And if there's any inkling today that there's children that are in the public school system and a teacher knows that you might have a Christian background, or parents that might discourage gender transition, they will secretly do whatever they need to do, as even to the point of bringing these children to clinics where they can get hormone treatments during school hours so that mom and dad don't find out. These are things that are happening all across our Western world. Parents are kept from knowing even what is happening with their children. And like I said earlier, children's entertainment is full of these things. The cartoons, the video games, social media. And one of the most scary things that we're seeing is that young people, and this is what I mean, they're after kids, young people, even before they even understand what sexuality is, they are mutilating themselves under a surgeon's knife, destroying their physical makeup. And that's really, really disgusting and sad for me to see. But I just want to close with this thought. What is the answer? There's so many. It's hard to not despair sometimes. But I want to end on a positive note, because there's a positive note. There's something we need to consider in all of these things. John 8:32 says this: you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. There's truth out there. And I'm excited to see that across our world there are brave people standing up and proclaiming truth, even in the midst of dire consequences. People are facing prison, massive fines, and are not backing down. In fact, I think it was earlier this week, one of our Canadian MPs, conservative MP, he's not probably the most popular guy. Some of you guys might know, I think his name is Jamal Giovanni or something like that. Some of you guys might know him. He's an MP in Bowmanville, just east of Toronto. Anyways, he made a statement on social media this week where he condemned what Mark Carney had done in the Pride parades. And went out and said, hey, why is this being celebrated in a land such as ours? And most of you guys know that media and everyone else, he was attacked from MPs. Every corner of our nation attacked him. And I thought, well, this guy's going to cave. He's going to apologize. He's going to have to write a statement that says how wrong he was for what he said. But he actually doubled down. I was actually really blessed to see that. He doubled down and said, no, this has no business being in our country. You know, what is really sad to me is our Conservative Party, you know, they don't support that. They're you know, not really much different than our governing Liberals when it comes to things like this. But we need brave men and women who stand up and say, you know what, I care about the truth. We need brave men and women who say, you know what, I'm going to run for mayor. I'm going to run for deputy mayor. I'm going to run for councillor. I'm going to get involved in politics in my local area, and I'm going to try to influence. We need people that want to stand up and say, I'm going to get involved in cultural reformation to change. If I can, I'm going to start here at home, and I'm going to change things around here. You know, it shouldn't just be one lone Canadian MP standing up. There should be pastors and preachers and evangelical leaders, but there should be people all over our nation that would stand up and realize that this battle is a demonic battle. And as Christian people, how are we going to be remembered at the end of the day? You know, are we going to stick our head in the sand? I was listening to a podcast last week by Family Talk Radio, James Dobson, who's now gone to be with the Lord. But he had interviewed a guy named Dr. Neil Shenvi, who has also made it his mission to try to help a lot of these people that have embraced the lie to detransition. And I just want to share briefly how he's helping people detransition. And he shares the testimony of a young woman that became a detransitioner. And in one of her essays, she writes this: throughout my childhood, when I came out as a trans man, I received nothing but affirmation and encouragement. Oh, you're brave, you're stunning. Everyone from her parents to her guidance counselors to her friends did nothing but tell her how awesome she was. And she says, looking back on it, she says, why did no one love me enough to tell me the truth about what I was doing for my body? I think this is the question that is affecting so many people. People are quiet. People are like, you know, that's not my business. And they just go on their merry day. Why aren't people doing what she says? You know, why did no one love me enough to tell me the truth about what I was doing to my body? And so he says, when we help detransitioners, we give them the example of an anorexic girl. The approach we take to transgender versus anorexia is totally incompatible. It's a double standard. You see this all over our culture today. And he says this: if a young girl came to you and said, I am fat, I want you to call me fatty from now on. I want you to help me get liposuction and to take diet pills because I'm convinced I am fat, and if you don't do those things, you don't love me. We would say to her, honey, I'm not going to do any of those things. I'm not going to call you fatty. I'm not going to help you get liposuction. I'm not going to, because you are literally 60 pounds and I'm dying of starvation. It is not in spite of my love for you that I won't do this. It is because I love you that I will not help you destroy yourself. And I genuinely mean that. That is how he says we should approach people caught up in this demonic transgender ideology where they are caving in to this lie. Not in spite of our love. You go to someone and you say, because of our love. It should not be hatred to tell you what you want to hear, because I'm too cowardly to tell you what you need to hear. This is, I think this is the approach we need to take. We need to love people enough to stand in their way. And one of the saddest things we're seeing, and this is why I feel like, maybe all of you are saying, well, I agree with you, and this is not an issue here. And yet, we are permeated and influenced by people all around us. And this kind of teaching is creeping in. And if nothing else, it's creeping in through the screen in our home. And we need to understand where we stand. When we see the evil day, like we're reading in Ephesians 6, to stand firm, we need to be willing to get in the way of people who are willing to destroy themselves. To love them enough to not affirm. And I think in the generations to come, a lot of parents are going to be left on the sidelines because they affirmed. What happens when this teenager who mutilated their body and has now, this young woman has now pretended to be a man, what if in her 20s she all of a sudden says, I've just destroyed myself. I'd love to have a baby. I'd love to experience femininity. And now it has been robbed from them by counselors and teachers and all kinds of people in the education system and media, and by mom and dad who said, oh, I affirm you. What is that young person, who are they going to turn to? Mom and dad are out of the picture. See, mom and dad ought never to support a sinful lifestyle. Siblings ought never to support a sibling who we know is living in sin. We see this nowadays, people coming around somebody who's living in sin and saying, well, they're a family member, so I better support them. What happened to truth prevailing? Truth ought to be more important than blood. And it's when we stand for truth, we will have a voice. When we stand for truth, people that went down the wrong road will be able to look back at us and say, I know somebody who values truth. That's what we need to consider in our world today. Loving people enough to confront them, not affirm them. And like I said earlier, there's some good progress being made. There's increasing stats showing. This is exciting to me. Young men, by the thousands and tens of thousands, are longing and looking to become more masculinized. They realize that they've been robbed. These young men are looking for feminine women. You're seeing the stats show this. Young men are increasingly realizing the diabolical lies from the pit of hell don't work. Doesn't lead to success. Doesn't lead to happiness. Young women are starting to embrace this more too. This is why in our recent Canadian election, the people who put the Liberals into power in large part were the old folks, the boomers. It's sad to see that. In fact, it was actually the young people that said, you know what, we see the dangers. So some of that is exciting. And even just recently, in the House of Commons, our MPs have been debating this whole idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is affecting all our workforces and people hiring. And you know what is interesting? Employers today, this is a good news part too, employers today are becoming increasingly hesitant to take people from universities. Because employers are saying, these people have been indoctrinated by values that we don't care about as a company, especially DEI. All across the U.S. this is happening. And there's an article written in that came out of the University of Waterloo just down the road, where one of the people from the University of Waterloo said, hey, Canada needs to start realizing too that DEI is a dead end. And so there's good things. People are getting more aware of these kinds of things. That's a good thing. And I look forward to the day where more of our politicians will stand up like this MP from Bowmanville. Because I think we owe our current generation the definition of truth. And I think the tide will turn. But I think you and I ought to be careful. What will our children and grandchildren say about us? When they look back and they say, yeah, Grandpa, yeah, Dad, he kind of just put his head in the sand. He kind of just pretended there wasn't an issue. And just went along with everything. And thought he couldn't do anything. And never got in the way. Never loved someone enough to stand in the way and said, I'm not going to let you destroy yourself. I mean, we need people all over our world to stand up and say, you know what, I'm not willing to affirm someone's lifestyle, but I'm going to continue to speak truth as much as I need to, even if it means I'm going to face problems. I mean, this message I'm preaching today, according to the laws of our land, is not even legal. We need to start realizing some of these things. Some of the new laws that have passed our land, somebody could come into this building and say, hey, Pastor, what you're preaching is hate. That's a hate crime. And you know what? I've made a decision in my heart. I'm willing to die on this hill. I'm willing to suffer the consequences if need be. And I think as people, as Christian people, we need to start to understand this influence of the demonic realm. And we need to realize this is coming from the pit of hell. There ought to be zero compromise in our life. And we have an answer in how we can change some things in our own lives. You know what? Throughout history, we see brave people that got in the way of politics, of popular opinion. It's interesting that it's the brave people today that we remember, that we revere, that we respect and honor. Not the cowards, not those who allowed money and the worship of material things and the worship of sexuality and all these other things to drag them down. We have a standard. And that's why, Paul says in Ephesians 6, stand therefore and clothe yourself in this belt of truth when you see that evil day. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for this day. Thank you for your love for us. Thank you for revealing truth to us. Lord, may the truth set us free. May we live by the truth on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. Though all the world may corrupt themselves and bow to this ancient demonic deity, Lord, that we see influencing today's world. Lord, as your people, would you protect us? Would you give us the courage and the wisdom to stand for the truth of your word, regardless of consequences? Father, I pray that as your people, we would love others enough to get in the way, regardless of what it may be. Maybe it's something totally unrelated to what we talked about here this morning. But Lord, give us the courage to love people enough to get in the way. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's a spouse. Lord, maybe it's a relative or friend. Lord, may we love with truth. May we balance it with mercy, but may truth never be compromised in our actions, in our speech, in our lifestyle. Father, shelter us under the blood of Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.